presidential policy directive from 2016. In other news, the nation's 538 presidential electors will meet tomorrow to cast the actual vote for president. Voting will begin at 10 a.m. in Indiana, Tennessee, and Vermont. The battleground states of Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania will begin at noon Eastern. Wisconsin follows at 1 p.m., and Michigan will meet at 2 p.m. Each elector casts 2 ballots, one for president and one for vice president, to be counted during a joint session of Congress on January 6th. But it's doubtful that the current president will accept those results. So could President Trump's effort to overturn this election be called a coup? Whatever word we use, the effort alone is dangerous for our democracy. In The Atlantic, contributing writer Zenia Tefeki, who has experience in coups or two from her home country in Turkey, writes, in part, quote, "The U.S. president is trying to steal the election, and crucially, his party either tacitly approves or is pretending not to see it. This is a particularly dangerous combination and makes it much more than just a typical Trumpian bluster or norm shattering." End quote. For more on this, I am joined by Natasha Bertrand, national security correspondent for Politico, and Jennifer Rubin, opinion writer for The Washington Post. Both are MSNBC contributors. Thank you for joining me right now. So, Natasha, I want to start with you. One of the things that you have done so effortlessly, it seems, is covering how foreign interference sometimes is used to upset our democracy, to start getting individuals to believe that if the sanctity of the ballot is not secure, then the public creates a distrust in government. Is this what's happening right now? Is this one of Trump's tactics?
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that we were hearing consistently from national security officials leading up to the 2020 election, is that while Russia, Iran, and China were making efforts to interfere in this election, and they were trying to muddy the waters for one candidate or another, there was a simultaneous effort by the president to undermine the legitimacy of the election that was arguably even worse. It was coming from the inside. And that was really counteracting all of the efforts that the national security apparatus in the United States were conducting in order to make sure that people had confidence in the legitimacy of their votes and the legitimacy of the election writ large. So in one sense, the fact that the Russians were trying to interfere in the election this time around really had nowhere near, or at least we don't know yet whether it did, but it seems to have had nowhere near the impact on people's confidence in this election as the president's own conduct has had. And that has really concerned people in the national security community, because how do you counteract it when the commander-in-chief, when the president of the United States is undermining all of their work and undermining their ability to instill confidence in the election?
And Jennifer, I think what's most striking is that how many folks within the Republican Party seem to be aligned with questioning the legitimacy of this presidency, of the presidency of Joe Biden. Can you speak a little bit to how unusual this is?
It is shocking. We have never had anything in the history of the Republic other than the Civil War itself. We had 126 members of Congress, including some of the people at the highest level of leadership, including Kevin McCarthy, sign on to a brief in the United States Supreme Court that essentially said some states, Trump states, wanted to throw out the votes of voters in Joe Biden's states. Unprecedented. That is a coup. He is trying to undo the election. He and other Republicans have refused to call the vice president, former vice president, now president-elect, the president-elect. You remember we had a very long delay in the transition process. And moreover, as your introduction indicated, it's not simply that they are pretending it's not going on. They are now adding credibility, adding weight to him with these constant refrains. Well, you have to let the process play itself out, as if there were any legitimate doubt whatsoever about the result. So it's very disconcerting. It's disconcerting you should have that many members of the House, that you should have 18 state attorneys general, all Republicans, of course, that you should have many other Republican senators eager to take on this fight and participating in efforts to perhaps interfere with and sway election officials, as you saw with Lindsey Graham. So it is not just that we have this horrible problem, as Natasha said, with the president of the United States. It's that an entire party seems to have given up on democracy.
So, Natasha, how do we tackle this? Because one of the biggest challenges as well is that there's 75 million voters who believe that Trump won legitimately. How do we actually put this genie back into the bottle when people are actually splicing facts and figures depending on who they supported?
It's a great question. I wish I knew the answer. I think that part of the issue here is that we really weren't prepared for this moment adequately. I remember my colleague and I wrote an article in June 2019 for Politico about what would happen if the president, Trump, refused to accept the results of the election, if he just refused to concede. And we went around and we were asking members of Congress what their plan was, Democrats primarily, because it was looking, even at that point, like the president really wasn't going to win a second term. And no one had a good answer. No one really was able to wrap their head around this idea that the president might just refuse to concede the election. At that point, it was really, well, we're just focused on winning. But that's really only one part of it, right? I mean, especially when you have 74 million people who voted for Donald Trump who now believe him when he says that their votes didn't matter. Obviously, some of those people might try to take this to its logical conclusion, right? If the president doesn't drop this effort, then as we saw with the massive protests here, the violence that took place and broke out in Washington, D.C. last night, it could become very, very ugly. So this is something I think that even if the president has been ham-handed about this and it hasn't worked out and it's been incompetent, his lawyers have failed in more than 55 lawsuits now. It's been completely transparent effort to just save face. This is something that moving forward, I think Democrats need to begin taking seriously, especially when members of Congress on the other side of the aisle are so willing to go along with something like this.
And Jennifer, something that we're seeing now is individuals that are trying to contest their elections at the local level because they're saying, I too have been done wrong by the local electoral officials. How does that help erode confidence in our election system? And when we look at how we actually fix this, what do we have to do in a bipartisan manner to address something that is very much threatening our democracy?
Well, it very much matters what the media says and what the political class says. It matters that when you have guests on who have signed this brief, that you introduce them as individuals who sought to overturn the last election. They should be labeled as people who betrayed our democracy. That's first of all. Second, when Nancy Pelosi is going to swear in the new House in January, she should make a big deal about this. She should remind these people what their oath of office is. She would, I think, encourage them to renounce their prior actions and rhetoric. And I also think it's incumbent upon the new President-elect Biden, once he's in office, to urge Republicans to stop this nonsense, to explain to the American people he is the legitimate president. And if they want to get anything done, and if they want to, frankly, maintain whatever shred of credibility that they have, it's time for them to start behaving like grown-ups in a democracy. So I think there's a lot of people who have a role to play, and I think we've already seen some election officials really step up to the plate, and we need the rest of them to step up as well.
And Natasha, I want to bring you in and just ask you very directly. It almost seems that what Trump has created is almost a playbook of how to digitalize elections for the next president that may be a little more savvy. How do we put language into what's happening and prevent this actually from demoralizing not just the voter, but our democracy?
I think this is one of the things that Zainab in her piece for The Atlantic addressed really, really eloquently, which is that, just because we may not have a specific word for what's happening right now, it may not be quite a coup, maybe it's more of a con, less of a coup. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't be taking it seriously. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be thinking of ways to describe the subtleties and the nuances in how the president and his allies are seeking to undermine our institutions. This is something that obviously needs to be addressed, as Jennifer said, by the president-elect moving forward, by his allies, by members of Congress, to fix these kinds of gaps, frankly, that exist and that allow these kinds of things to happen. The president has been allowed, essentially, and his attorneys have been allowed to just run rampant through the legal system, even though over 50 of their election challenges have failed already. So where's the accountability there? There's a lot here, I think, that we've just never experienced before as a democracy, that if the president, being as ham-handed as he has been about this, if he is replaced or succeeded by someone who is perhaps a bit more competent, they could potentially really succeed in the future in trying to overturn legislation.